Hello, this is Alec Glover, and today I'm going to try to prove to you that renting a GPU is a way better deal than owning infrastructure. The context that I'm coming from is I owned about 1,000 GPUs that we were renting to people, and I've consistently seen the rental rates drop over the last 3 years, whereas the value of the infrastructure has either stayed the same or appreciated. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to use Claude Code, whip up a little front-end application that lets us quickly compare the long-term projections of owning a GPU versus renting it. So here we go. The way that we're going to do this is I've written enough context here, I think, to get us started in comparing rental rates to the cost of just purchasing the servers that you'd otherwise be renting. Now, that's obviously not inclusive of all of the things it takes to run your own private cloud, but I think it's enough to essentially just compare the capital purchase against the operational just renting the GPUs. So keep in mind, this doesn't include any labor. So like network engineers, IT people, there's the software costs for all of the different tools you're going to need to actually efficiently run all this infrastructure. There is the networks. So with those big H200, B200 clusters, you're typically putting in like an InfiniBand cluster or something else that is also going to cost you millions of dollars. So this is a very basic comparison, and I still think even giving all of that bias towards buying infrastructure, it's still going to look like a pretty good deal just to rent the GPUs. So I'm going to dump this into Claude. I don't know how much of that I'll actually include in the video, but I think in one shot here we'll get something usable, and then I'll kind of guide it just to make it appear how I'm sort of picturing it in my head. Claude whipped up a great interface, actually, I think, for me to just kind of talk over some of the points I had. And, we can run a couple different scenarios where I think it makes sense to buy infrastructure, as well as the scenarios where I just think the rental market is so friendly right now. Jumping into it, honestly, I think the biggest thing to clarify here is that a 2 to 3 year payback period or break-even point on renting it versus buying it, or buying it to rent it, a 2 to 3 year payback period is really risky in this business because GPUs release every 2 to 3 years, right? There's always going to be another SKU that you're going to be competing with after that time frame, and your ability to rent that GPU out or justify continuing using that old hardware in 3 years is going to be it's going to be a lot more difficult, right? So you look at something like a 4090 that, when the market for them first started, we were getting like 60 to 80 cents an hour renting them out, right? And you can see after 3 years, it's only like 30 cents an hour. And this goes even lower in a lot of cases where, if you locked in for a year, I'm sure there's providers that would do 25 cents an hour for these. So, the rental market is great. And I think that after 3 years, if you're broken even, I still think that that's a very attractive option, because you're also not incurring any of the costs of doing this yourself, right? And that might be costs of, obviously you've got to spend your time, you need a facility, you need to make sure that this stuff is online, but it might just be the costs of, you might do worse of a job than if you just bought this, right, from the market. And there's a lot that goes into that too, where if you were to rent these GPUs from 3 different providers, you already have 3 different, geo-separate locations that you can load balance. You get the redundancy between all of those places. So I think it's one of those things that if you're not making money until year 4 and 5, and year 4 and 5 is probably when you'd want to switch GPUs anyways, it's just like, it's a really, really tough thing to justify, I think, to yourself. Especially too, if I know I'm continuing to ramble here, but especially too, like if your business is trying to, make something in AI and be competitive in AI, then, buying infrastructure that forces you into some form of technical limitation over a long time horizon while this stuff continues to evolve, I think just puts your entire value prop at risk, right? If the technology changes and, there's something that you want to take advantage of, but you can't because, you're sitting there in a warehouse with 100 4090s, that's a huge issue, right? I don't think that shaving, 20, 30% off on your infrastructure costs right now is important over, just making something that's truly useful and scalable in AI. But anyways, jumping into it, I think the scenario where it does make sense to buy your GPU servers is if you're going to have it for, you're going to have that same need for 3 years. Let's say you have a model that you just know you have to run, it fits on a certain card, or it fits on a certain card with tons of headroom, and you just know that you need to have that for 3 years. That your utilization is going to be at 100%. And that's where it gets really gnarly is if, there's a scenario where, you only need 50% utilization, then buying something makes no sense because you should just rent the thing for, the months that you need the thing and then don't be paying for it when you don't need it, right? Whereas if you buy it, you're paying for it all the time. So yeah, buying makes sense if you have a locked in technical specification for at least 3 years. The other scenario or the other case is if you have the sort of the fixed costs already covered. Now that could be the data center, maybe you literally have a data center and just adding one of these in to use up excess capacity. You could view that as zero marginal cost on your side and maybe justify it. And the same goes for the expertise around that, right? It's not like you need to hire the people to support this thing. And the real risk you run, I think here, is if you don't have an existing system around hosting your own infrastructure, you taking that on might not just be the cost of you taking it on, it might actually just be technical debt, essentially, where, if this is not what you're an expert in, you'll do a worse job at doing it than the company that all they do is run infrastructure, right? And it's back to that point is if you're an AI company that, needs to run models and needs to continue to iterate and make their AI product better, you really shouldn't be worrying about, the GPUs that are underneath that, right? I think that they're finicky, it's hard. And if there's a company that's willing to do that and willing to do it at, sort of a low double digits premium, I think it's a great deal. So specifically around some numbers, I think that we'll go with some aggressive numbers here. So I know that in the market right now, you can rent a 4090 for 25 cents an hour, sorry. And that would be if you went to a company and you said, hey, the next year I want sort of a meaningful amount of 4090s, willing to lock in 25 cents an hour. There's data centers that have those hosted that will absolutely do that. In terms of if you were to DIY it, I think the absolute minimum that you need to factor in around the facility is at least $75 a kilowatt per month. This is sort of the numbers on a warehouse facility. If you're to just take a warehouse with a bunch of power, buy some UPS, buy some air conditioning, cut a few holes in the ceiling, you're looking at, all in across maybe a couple hundred kilowatts, you'd be paying about $75 a kilowatt a month. So that's kind of how those numbers work there. And you'll see after just under 2 years, you're going to ROI that on the 4090s. And I think this is where those other factors I talked about really come into play is, you need to consume a 4090 for the next 2 years straight, at least. This starts to look like a pretty good deal, right? But if all you know is that, hey, we can probably use this for the next year, and then it's unclear after that year whether you need it or not, I think that's where it starts to become a real risk in buying something like this, because to renew your 4090 contract a year from now, it might only be 20 cents an hour. And then, to sign on for another year after that, those cards will be so far past their, expected point of life that I don't even know if anyone would sign another 1 year with you. You'd probably be getting the 5090s at that 25 cent an hour rate. So I think that's where having certainty in your workload and having certainty in the need for that technical specification goes a really, really long way. And then the part that totally blows us out of the water is if your plan is to rent these to somebody, you're not getting 100% utilization. From the time that you spend that money to them being plugged in and somebody paying you, I would challenge that unless you absolutely have a system you're dumping this into already, you're not going to clear 75% utilization. So that pushes the ROI out to, right in that 2 to 3 year mark. where it's like, if you're doing all this work, taking all this risk, and you have to execute this perfectly until, year 3, and then you can start to get paid. I just think it's a really, really tough thing to justify. So that's for the consumer cards. They're actually more friendly in terms of this kind of math than the enterprise stuff, because with the enterprise stuff, like, it's being done at such massive scale that there's companies, doing this sort of napkin math on, huge spreadsheets with billions of dollars. I think the example I want to do just for the video is probably the B200. This is a new GPU this year, or it came out sort of towards the end of last year. And, it's almost a $400,000 piece of equipment. It's a huge server, draws a ton of power. You would never justify putting it in anything other than a tier 3 data center. And in terms of rental rates, like, I've seen everything from $265 an hour to $425 an hour, depending on how long you want to rent it for, where's it located. It's like truly the Wild West. But I think if you're like a well-informed purchaser, like, you could negotiate a 2-year contract probably, at $275 an hour for the next 2 years. And your purchase cost is going to be, you're not going to ROI that until after that 2.5-year period, right? And I think too, like, even if you negotiated a 1 year at $325 or something like that, you would still have like a 2-year ROI. But after 1 year, you could probably negotiate that second year a lot lower, right? Like, if we're seeing 265s in the market now, like, that's for sure going to be available then, right? And I think, like, you could probably reach a blended average around that 250 to 265 mark. So that puts you, it's 2.5 to 3 year ROI at 100% utilization. And so that's your last factor is, like, if you're a company, you've got the expertise, you've got maybe the facility, you already know what you need to do with this. Like, the day it shows up, you're going to utilize it. I think it makes sense maybe to buy, right? Like, it's within 2.5 to 3 years that you'll ROI, but you've at least got some life left in it. It's if you're not sure that you need that for the full 3 years, that this just starts to make no sense at all. And so that's kind of the point that I wanted to make. That's why I wanted to make a video about, renting GPUs versus buying GPUs, because a lot of people just see the sticker price of a 4090 and they're like, oh, well, 21 grand, like, you rack that up pretty quick in rental costs, but you just forget everything else that goes into, like, running a stable piece of infrastructure and doing that consistently over a long time horizon. It's quite difficult. So that's the video for today. If you like this kind of content, let me know and I'll do more.